Thank you all for being here this evening. The structure of this event will first be introductions, then a reading and discussion with award-winning author Katherine Standefer. And lastly, we'll have some time to take questions and comments. Sorry about my doggy there. If you have any technical difficulties, feel free to type in your concern in the chat box and we'll assist you there. To ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand so you can be unmuted and ask yourself. Or you can type it in the chat box or that Q&A box and we will address them at the appropriate time. Katherine Standefer is the author of Lightning Flowers, My Journey to Uncover the Cost of Saving a Life, which was a finalist for the 2021 Kirkus Prize in Nonfiction. Lightning Flowers was selected as a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice staff pick, named one of Oprah Magazine's best books of fall 2020, and shortlisted for the 2018 J. Anthony Lukas Work in Progress Prize from Columbia Graduate School of Journalism and the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University. Most recently, Lightning Flowers was a finalist for the Arizona-New Mexico Book Award in Memoir. Previously, Standefer's essay in Praise of Contempt won the 2015 Iowa Review Award in Nonfiction and was selected for the Best American Essays 2016. And her other work has appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Virginia Quarterly Review, New England Review, and elsewhere. She was a 2017 Marion Weber Healing Arts Fellow at the Mesa Refuge and a 2018 Logan Nonfiction Fellow at the Carey Institute for Global Good. Standefer earned her MFA at the University of Arizona and teaches for Ashland University's Low-Residency MFA. She lives on a piñon and juniper-studded mesa in New Mexico with her chickens. Please welcome author Katherine Standefer. For those of us who have not yet checked out Lightning Flowers, can you start us out by telling us a little bit about your book?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. Thanks to everyone who's here tonight. So Lightning Flowers tells the story of my troubled relationship to my own implanted cardiac defibrillator, which is a device that should be life-saving ideally, but which has been a lot more complicated in my story. And so the book opens when I pass out in a parking lot at age 24 while uninsured in 2009, pre-Obamacare, and have to figure out how to access what could be life-saving care. And then the book follows my journey through the healthcare system into the post-Obamacare era as well, in which I've had the technology a bit longer and start to experience some of its darker aspects. The book is also really about what it takes to make a life-saving device. So the prologue opens with the night in November 2012 that I took 3 accidental shocks to the heart from my implanted cardiac defibrillator and found myself thinking, like, what is this metal inside me and where did it actually come from? And is it possible that other people's lives were compromised in the making of this life-saving device? And so one strand of the book travels to factories where the device was actually put together, as well as mines, mostly on the African continent, although I did visit many in the American West, really looking at what are the human rights implications? What are the ecosystem impacts of taking metal from the ground and making what we think of as life-saving device?
Would you mind sharing a piece from a chapter of Lightning Flowers to get a better taste for the journey you take your readers on?
I would love to. And I felt really moved tonight to read from the moments that I decided that I was going to attempt to access this device for sure. So when I first passed out in the parking lot, it's relevant to tell you all that I was already aware that there was a genetic arrhythmia in my family. My younger sister had started going into cardiac arrest at age 18 when she was a freshman at University of Colorado at Boulder. And I, at the time, was living up in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and working as a ski instructor and a climbing guide. And as an uninsured person, especially, I was kind of like, well, yeah, I could go get an EKG and see if I have this thing, but who like takes their day off and goes to the hospital to ask for an EKG and pays out of pocket? And I think some part of me was avoiding doing that because I had this gut sinking sense that if anyone else in the family had it, I did. So of course, not rational to skip getting that EKG, but when I woke up in the parking lot, I immediately knew that it was going to be the same thing as my sister. And so I got a second opinion from her cardiologist down in Boulder, who really cared about the family a lot. And so this is after my second opinion and after that doctor has told me that I need to make my arrangements. I need to figure out how to get this device that is likely to cost $180,000 out of pocket if I don't have some other kind of plan. On their last night in town, my parents and I convened in the red-walled, book-lined library of the bed and breakfast. My father, tall and brown-haired, wore circular glasses that made him look like the intellectual he was. My mother, with bangs and blonde hair to her shoulders, always tan despite her religious use of sunscreen, filled a napkin with cookies. The elephant in the room, all trip, of course, had been the question of how I might access surgery. Though they'd wanted to meet with just me, Sam was adamant. Of course I want to be there, he said. This is my boyfriend at the time. And we were all secretly pleased. Over white teacups of decaf coffee, we reviewed my options. Could I get on Medicaid to pay for the surgery? No. In 2009, you had to fit into certain categories to qualify, like being blind or being a parent to a young child. My dismal income alone didn't qualify me. Some states had a Medicaid expansion program that kicked in if you accrued a certain amount of medical debt, but Wyoming wasn't one of them. Some states had high-risk insurance pools, which cost a lot to buy into, but would cover you after a waiting period. Wyoming wasn't one of these either. Our little hospital in Jackson, St. John's, had provided financial aid for my emergency room visit, but they were too small to offer advanced cardiac care. And I'd already confirmed that you couldn't somehow transfer your local status to the nearest hospital that did. Katie, is there a possibility of finding a job in Jackson with benefits? My dad said. I applied for that social work job, I said, but we all knew that in overeducated Jackson, with the economy plummeting, my qualifications did not translate to a professional job with the state. I was beginning to understand that there was not going to be a way to salvage the life I'd been living. The life I had known was gone, unrecoverable, not durable enough to weather this health crisis. In the past 2 years, I had taught writing and skiing and backpacking, sung at weddings and circled fancy parties offering hors d'oeuvres. I had swept cabins and figure modeled, scrubbed toilets and made beds, run birthday parties and written grants. I thought in my own way I was doing it, finding a way to stay in the valley, publishing some poems, working on a novel. But I had failed myself in some other way I saw then, in the precariousness of being spottily employed, in not keeping insurance, in trying to prioritize a writing life. I wished desperately for my parents' sake to be some other version of myself, studying international relations or law, coordinating programs or teaching somewhere, taking a salary and insurance from a university or think tank or nonprofit. I had been authentic to my deepest desires at the cost of my own security, and that seemed fine until it was security I needed. Yet in truth, I couldn't imagine living another way without attention to what made me come alive, without prioritizing the craft that felt like my purpose on the planet. It would take years for me to understand that I had not failed myself as much as been failed by a healthcare system that required a particular submission to conventionality, a positioning some couldn't access at all, and which required that the rest of us remain smaller, less bold and creative in our living, more attached to institutions of power. I was born from muddy, ragged places and time that moved according to a different logic. And now despair rose in me, for the conventional routes to insurance felt far away and impossible, and more than anything, built for someone else. A professor of mine whom I'd asked for advice had suggested I seek heart surgery abroad. He'd said there were lots of safe countries where a procedure could be done more cheaply. The suggestion fell flat, my parents dismissive. Dr. Oza's nurse Emily had warned me that the surgery could cost as much as $180,000 without insurance because of the way uninsured patients didn't benefit from the negotiated down rates insurance companies received. Why didn't I have the surgery and then declare bankruptcy? I didn't have much to lose, a beat up Subaru and a bunch of old backpacking gear. Even my skis were 10 years old. But my dad widened his eyes, shook his head. Let's avoid that if at all possible, he said. Could you be someone's political darling? My mom asked. Yeah, maybe if you could make one of the senators associated with healthcare reform aware of you, they could raise some publicity and money, my dad said. Too bad Wyoming representatives aren't the ones making the case for reform, Sam said. I just don't know who we would approach for that. We were hitting a wall and just one more idea sat heavy between us. My dad spoke it aloud. But in Colorado, Dr. Oza would donate his surgical fee. And if you wait long enough to establish residency, there's a program that might help with your other costs. Yes, I said, the Colorado Indigent Care Program. Dr. Oza's nurse was telling me about it. And I heard from one of my Colorado friends that it saved her from crazy bills after she tore her ACL. But you have to really live there, or they have to think you do. I paused. I looked it up. Residency means 3 months, or as soon as you're employed. Sam squeezed my hand. I could go, become a resident, have the surgery, and come home again. My dad fixed his gaze on me. How soon could you move? I swallowed. I'm figure modeling Monday and Wednesday. It's $30 an hour all day, so it's worth staying for. So the first week of September, my mom said. Listen, Katie, my dad said, leaning forward. I can't pay for the surgery. That would be financially ruinous. He was speaking as someone who'd just taken a hit in the recession, who'd spent years working for one corporation that filed for bankruptcy, and then another that seemed always to be announcing layoffs, who'd just paid for one daughter's college and was on to the next. Someone who'd suddenly been saddled with the moral hazard of his daughter's passions. But I'm not going to let you go under, he said, and my eyes filled with tears. I will help you, he said, until you can get a job. With rent and food, I'm not going to get involved with things like your student loans. I would guess that you can go a few months without paying with only minor penalty, and you may be able to defer. That will be your deal. Let's just communicate about what you need. Thank you, I said. What he offered filled me with both shame and relief. It's only a few months, my dad said. Yeah, I looked at Sam. It's only a few months. But it didn't feel like a few months. I knew how slippery life could be, the way we end up in places we didn't mean. How when you opened a door and walked through it, sometimes it shut behind you. As I looked at job listings and apartment listings in Boulder over the week that followed, a deep grief pulled at me. I'd moved to Wyoming thinking I would build my life there. I'd first come to that valley as a 14-year-old and had missed only 2 summers since. I'd written 2 senior theses on the area. This had been the place that opened me, that brought me to myself, spending my summers in the heady, hot smell of sage, ducking moose in the willows, judging autumn by the moment that fireweed bloomed its top raceme. At the edge of winter, pulling the bird feeders inside so the bears wouldn't come onto the roof for them, feeding the fire on those coldest winter nights, walking out the back door into forests that went on for hundreds of miles, snowshoeing across the valleys where the only marks in the snow revealed the drama of a fox chasing lunch. A great many people came to that valley and move on without thrusting roots into its rocky soil. But this was not my story. Yet I knew that the sooner I went, the sooner I would become a Colorado resident, the sooner I could have the surgery, the sooner I could move on with my life. The defibrillator, though I loathed the thought of it, was the answer to the threat of death. I could not live, I was realizing, without that answer. I'm skipping ahead just by a page and a half. Mid-morning on September 2nd, Sam and I stood at the edge of our long gravel drive at our boat cabin, holding each other as I sobbed. How do I keep you? He asked, stricken. The last thing I saw of East Simpson Avenue driving away was my love in the side mirror, breaking into a dead run. He chased the car until I crossed Redmond, his shirt a maroon blur. Then his feet seemed to slap against the black pavement, his body lurching as he tried to stop following, momentum carrying him further than he meant to go. On my first afternoon in Boulder, my sister took me to half-fast subs when she got out of class. At the front door, she pushed a few dollars into my hand. Get a picture of Long Island's, Christine said, then went outside to save a table. On the patio, sunglassed and underage, she poured for us. We sat on the wood slats at dusk, and for the first time, I touched the smooth line of her scar, the hard spot above her left breast. I realized she'd never told me about her surgery a year and a half earlier, and I looked her in the eye. What will it be like? She looked away. The doctors tell you nothing, she said. And then she told me herself how riding in cars would be torture, the seatbelt pressing onto the incision and the defibrillator, not yet held in place by scar tissue, bumping up and down inside the body cavity. How I would have to go into salons to have my hair washed in those lean back sinks so I didn't get the stitches wet. Or on the other hand, force the weight of the device against the stitches from the inside by leaning forward. How I would not be able to dress myself or do the dishes or carry anything or sit up or lie down or reach up. How my friends might be awkward and the ache would be deep and awful. She cried and I cried. And as the night darkened and traffic rolled up and down Broadway, people pushed in beside us, took over our table, until finally we were just two drunk sisters leaning in together in the midst of a party, except for the strange, tender way we kept touching the upper left quadrant of our chests.
Thank you so much for sharing that. This is your unique experience, of course, but it's also a universal one, with the fact that many, many people struggle with the American healthcare systems. Can you share a little bit about your process and what it was like to write Lightning Flowers? It's a lot about your personal difficult journey with your health, but you also did a lot of research for your book on mining and the medical industry. Can you talk a little bit about that in your writing process?
Yeah, there was so much research. So I understood, even as I was living these events, that they would probably be a book one day. As you heard in that excerpt, I was a novelist and a poet. And I very quickly realized that this was going to have to be nonfiction. There was something fundamental I didn't understand about the experience that made it hard for me to translate onto external characters. And so I understood that in telling the story, I was really sort of excavating myself. And so I applied to Master of Fine Arts programs from the day job that I took once I lived in Boulder, which was at a little health clinic, in 2012, and started this master's program. And I knew that I was going to write roughly about these experiences, but I had no idea what the frame would be until that night that I took those accidental shocks to the heart and started thinking about the materials and minerals. And in some ways, that really complicates the story. And in some ways, it made it possible because there's such a narrative that writing about illness alone is somehow self-indulgent or boring or not enough of a story. And so I feel like those journalistic components, especially traveling abroad and reporting back from places people had not been, most readers have not been, that sort of unlocked a different readership and possibility within the publishing world. But at the same time, where you started your question is so true. It fundamentally is the story of a body moving through these systems. And I made a really specific choice at kind of a specific time, not to try to recreate all of the books that exist by very wonderful journalists that explain how the American healthcare system came to be. I really tried to keep the explanation of the healthcare system really short and clean, because those books do already exist. And I wanted folks who are operating, who are living their lives out of a different corner of the medical system, perhaps with private insurance through corporate jobs, to be able to enter this experience and really have the focus on, like, what does it mean for a body moving through these rooms? And there are some pieces of that everybody might experience pretty similarly within the system. And then there are pieces of that vary greatly depending on where you're getting your insurance from, which hospitals and practitioners you can access, what color your skin is, and therefore how people are treating you in emergency rooms or in situations where you might be in pain, what your gender is, right? So for me, the top goal was really like, I've had this wild experience in the American healthcare system. that unfortunately is not actually even that rare. And so how can I tell that story in a way that hasn't been told before? But, long QT syndrome is a problem with the heart's electricity, and that makes it really technical, and defibrillators themselves are really technical. And a lot of the breakages of the technology or problems with technology that I've had in my body, they all require unpacking for a reader. And so there's a certain amount of just, how do I make sure that people understand the engineering problems of putting a box with microelectronics and a battery inside your chest wall, and then running a wire down your vein and corkscrewing it into the heart so it will stay in place while the heart is beating. And that wire needs to then withstand all of that movement and wetness and like body stuff growing on it. Things are constantly being colonized in the body. And so what are you insulating that wire with? And what are the different options for that even? And so there's sort of like all of these rabbit holes that luckily in the space of a book, I could get into, but I really tried to make sure they were specific to what the reader needs to really access the experience. On the other side, thinking about the supply chain of the device, which the two strands really sort of like collide during my visits to factories, right? Because the device is present, and also we're in the process of making, we're thinking about like who puts it together and what does it take to put it together. There's a series of tests that they run before the devices are allowed to leave those manufacturing facilities called the grandma test. And it's basically like, would you want this in your grandma? Do you feel good enough about the way this has been designed and executed? And now we're sort of pushing it to its limits, and we understand like, okay, it's going to do its job. It's not going to hurt anyone. Yes, we'll send it out to grandma, which of course, like, hi, 24-year-old with a defibrillator. I'm 36 now, but I think a lot of this book is really in some ways about that mismatch between who we assume a technological intervention is for and who gets it. But I started with the factories very quickly after my shocks to the heart, because I lived in Tucson, Arizona at the time, and St. Jude Medical happened to have, which is the manufacturer of my first device, they happened to have a facility about 2 hours away in the Phoenix area. So I drove up to Scottsdale and really understood very little about the device, and had this wonderful engineer who just was like so delighted to have a patient on site, because they don't get to meet many of us. And he explained so much to me. And then it was really off to the races. Like, what are the other places I would need to visit in order to really ask this question? And the question on the mining side really began with worst case scenarios in mining. I was thinking a lot, because the year was 2012. The Congo had just been declared the rape capital of the world because of conflict mineral scenarios in which warlords were able to take over these pits and then use the funds to purchase weapons and continue terrorizing local populations. So I was most concerned about conflict minerals at the beginning, but I ended up getting really interested in corporate social responsibility. And the question of like, can you have like good mines? Like, what does that even look like? What have we learned through all these years of extracting things from the ground and human rights conflicts? And like, have we learned something? And so what would it be like to visit like a good mine, a mine that's winning awards for its social responsibility planning? And ultimately, once I identified a mine that both had things that were inside my body, meaning the type of mineral, it turned out to be impossible to actually track anything specific to its source, which just says a lot about how our supply chains work in this current global system. But once I had a mine that was compelling to me and felt safe to visit, and I had some toeholds in, and it had the right minerals, I applied for a lot of grants, and I didn't get them for about a year. And I ended up running a Kickstarter project in the spring of 2014, where we raised $17,000 in 20 days. And then I had to confront the fact that I had no idea how to do that kind of reporting. So, so this story really like trained me in who I needed to be in order to write it at every step. And I spent 6.5 weeks both on the island of Madagascar and then a tiny bit in South Africa. A few years later, I had a job back on the African continent, actually in Tanzania, and I like lobbed on a little plane ticket to Rwanda to visit a mine there. And I also was doing a ton of book research in the background, because not having done a lot of international reporting where I didn't even speak the second language, right? In Madagascar, the colonial history is French. And so Malagasy folks speak whatever the local dialect is. And then if they have a secondary language, it's French, and that's not what I speak. And so I had to find trilingual interpreters, which the whole process was just wacky. And so in the background, I was like reading all the white papers I could find, doing a lot of interviews that were either off the record or that I didn't use in the book, just to make sure I understood the iceberg that I was trying to show the tip of. Because when you have a big question like, does it cause loss of life to create a medical technology? And even more specifically, like, is my own life worth it? Like, you have to just amass a really enormous set of experiences. I think you have to sort of like steep in it to be able to say, okay, now I can guide a reader through this. Now I can decide, I'll show this part, I'll show this part, I'll show this part, I'll create some discussions that help them move between those. And then I guess the last piece of writing this book was really just in the process of trying to tell my own story within the healthcare system. I really had to recognize how deeply, deeply traumatized I was by it. And the good news about this book was that I sold it on pitch in late 2017. For folks who've read the book, they might recognize that this book ends in 2017. So I had just been at the Mayo Clinic, and it was really overwhelming. Like, it was exciting on a career level, like I sold my book. And then I sat down and was like, and these things I have to write about. Some of them are old traumas and they're relatively resolved, but some of them were gaping open and I'd been running away from them. And so part of the research was almost like a self-research of, how do I work with my physiological symptoms and my, like, how do I learn to hear the way I'm telling this story and realize, like, is that actually the story that needs to be told? You know, like anybody does in therapy, really like reckoning with the ideas they've gotten about things and having to step into my authority of like, you actually can speak back to doctors here. You actually can be really, really angry on the page in some of these areas. And it doesn't have to be an anger that is trying to like get revenge on anyone in particular, but it is the kind of speaking out of a space where you were powerless, where you hope that the book will create some kind of further conversation or movement, give medical practitioners and systems engineers some of the material they need in order to really think harder about how we can fix some of this stuff.
Thank you.
I know there's such a long answer. We just traveled.
No, it's great. Thank you so much. Do you feel that you processed some of your trauma? I mean, it was a lot to process. Did this help you process your trauma with your experience by writing this book? Would you recommend the writing process to others to work through their trauma?
Oh, that's a really loaded question. So off of this screen, part of what I do, or I guess on this same screen during different hours, I call myself a trauma writing doula. And so it actually, since 2016, I've been teaching trauma writing classes, which I trained for in part at the Arizona Trauma Institute, as well as with a lot of reading on my own, and work with somatic practitioners, body workers, energy workers. And so I now work one-on-one with people trying to help them move difficult stories through their bodies. And that work is not for the faint of heart. So I think one thing I will say is that the research really shows that when we write about difficult topics, there's sort of like a pool of things that are really hard And also, if we write about them, we will actually feel better. The researcher James Pennebaker theorizes that there's actually a holding back function in the body, where when we're carrying around this stuff and not telling our stories and not able to integrate it and own it, we're actually like wasting energy. And his studies showed that people who were writing every day about hard things had improved immunological markers and also fewer health clinic visits. I think he was at the University of Houston. So that effect is real, but there's also this category of stuff that's so traumatic that the way it's stored in the body is really different. And if you're going to write into that, you can re-traumatize yourself far more than gaining positive effects. And so a lot of my work is helping people sort of feel out like, is this grief? And I can sort of like sit down and give my grief some time and then be gentle to myself afterward? Or am I really writing into the heart of like a physiological nervous system issue that has, it is my body trying to keep me safe, and also it's time to remove it, but that's probably going to require support from a practitioner. So the real answer for me is I processed an enormous amount of trauma. And actually, so I sold the book in late 2017, and in the fall of 2018, I sublet my house and I was living on the road doing all these writing residencies and sort of mopping up my research. And I just felt like I was sort of skirting around the book. I had written some of the far away long ago stuff that was already processed, and I sort of wasn't getting into the second half, and I couldn't quite figure out why. And I ended up renting this little earth home out on the far end of Glorieta Mesa, which I now live at the base of Glorieta Mesa, so this is wild. And I basically came to understand that like I couldn't write this book without doing trauma work full time. And I luckily had a very amazing somatic therapist. I had some body workers here in town. And yeah, as things came up, I would move slowly enough to just be with whatever came up. And an example of this is there's a scene where I wake up after a surgery in which a wire has snapped off in my heart. And I wake up where they have not removed the piece that is holding my femoral artery open, where they did part of the procedure. It's called the sheath. And they're supposed to move the sheath while you're under, and they hadn't removed it. So they pull out the sheath while I'm awake, and then they have to apply pressure to that wound so that every time the heart beats, there's not like blood. Sorry, it's very graphic. Most painful moment of my life. You know, this nurse jammed her hand in my groin to hold that pressure, and then she clamped me to the bed with like a C-clamp. And so, you know, as a body, I know what that experience is like. And it was encoded all over me. I mean, there were all sorts of other muscle groups that had started working weirdly since that procedure. I actually could barely walk at the time I was working on this scene. And so in order to describe it for readers, I actually had to watch YouTube videos of this procedure so that I could see, like, what are they doing? What is that piece called? How do I translate that into something really accessible for readers? And you can't have your intellectual brain going if your reptilian brainstem, if your fight or flight brain is all lit up. And so I would press play on this video, and sometimes I would only make it 3 seconds, and then I would press pause. And I would be breathing, I would hold a hand over my heart, which is really, comforting to me. Sometimes I screamed. I just screamed and screamed and screamed, like whatever needed to come out. And then I took it really slow. I did a lot of walking when I could walk. I did a lot of napping. I went to Oho and 10,000 Waves. And it was what we would call not fun. And when I turned in my copy edits last summer, basically 50 pounds melted off my body. It just felt like I had been carrying around all of this weight that suddenly could go. So I know that's not the way it works for everyone. So I healed a ton through this book. There are also things that I'm not sure will ever fully heal. And there are a lot of things at the end of this book that are still ongoing. And so you can only adjust to them a certain amount when we're talking about like living with ongoing threat.
Wow. That's such an experience. And I'm so sorry, but I'm so appreciative that you are sharing this with the world. Your sister as you've already mentioned, has similar medical condition as you. What was her involvement in your writing and research? And was she okay with being involved in this process?
Yeah, it's such a good question. It's like pretty clear pretty early on in the book that we're very different people. And I have this obsessive writer brain that can't go through something and not like fully process it and spiral out. And she really is a good compartmentalizer. I mean, to be 18, to be in your first few weeks of college and start going into cardiac arrest. And she didn't know what it was for quite some time. So she had her first heart surgery at the end of the semester during finals. And then the wire moved in her heart. So she had another surgery 4 months later. So to have 2 heart surgeries before your 20th birthday is a lot. And she was like a sorority girl and she worked at Noodles and Company, and like she would find dresses that could cover up the scar, right? Where like that's never really something that I've worried about too much. And so there was a particular power imbalance there where she really could have said to me, like, you can have the bare bones, but like, I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to do this. Like, she didn't ask me to change her name, which was an extraordinary gift. She sat down with me and I would say things like, okay, so after you had your first heart surgery and it's Christmas and you go home, you know, what were your friends like? And she would say, oh, there was this one party. And it was like, what were you wearing? What were they wearing? What were you eating? You know, like I need to be able to build scenes. And she gave me access just to all of that. I have all her medical records. I would be texting her and be like, how many accidental shocks? Like, is this the right order? And I think part of why that was possible is that sharing this experience, although it was a little rocky at first because I really needed her and she wanted to avoid it, you know, when we were still in our 20s, ultimately we were the only other people we knew who had been through this. And we really developed a different kind of sisterhood and a friendship that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't sort of like bombed into the town where she was living and like needed her very specific advice. Had the same doctor, you know, we got our devices checked at the same time. It was like weird twinsies. So we take a lot of pictures like with the scars out together and it's geeky. But I think ultimately there's a bravery that she appreciated in me where once she was like sort of being forced to deal with these things a little bit more or learning about what was inside her through me. It's not that that's pleasurable or fun, especially when we're talking about the way technologies can break and the way systems can malfunction. But I think ultimately there's only so long any of us can carry something around unintegrated before we really start feeling the impact of that. And within really the year before the book came out, she was kind of having some of that breaking, just like, why am I crying so much? Why is it coming out when I'm drunk? I mean, it just sort of was like seeping at the edges. And so I think the book ended up being really healing. And I did, you know, I gave her a chunk of my advance money for mental health support services if she needed them. Like I know I'm putting you through a lot. And the great news has been that people have not been like trying to track her down or being weird to her. You know, you don't know how big a book is going to get and whether or not you'll have crazy celebrity stuff occur like that. But it's been fine. And actually it's been really, I think, beautiful for both of us to end up hooked up to a much richer network of both people with sudden cardiac arrhythmias, people living with technologies in their body. The one last piece I will say that is really different between us is that she's always had access to healthcare through sort of the more enviable systems. She's always had private access. And so her problems have not been with the system. And I think there's a way that she has watched my experience almost as the shadow twin and just really had to hold gratitude for her own experience. And so she knew that no portrait of this healthcare system was complete without both of us being there. She's the one who's had her life saved by the device, and I'm the one who's had my life endangered by the device.
Thank you. Yeah, you guys are lucky to have one another, as unlucky as your health has been. You both are so brave and strong, and very admirable. The book talks a lot about privilege as well. You write an interesting examination on privilege. Can you talk a little bit about why you wanted to highlight that, how it became such an important part of the book?
Yeah, there's a real tradition of books being written with sort of middle to upper class white males in mind as their audience in general. And then, if we widen that to include women, we're still often talking about white people and those who have grown up with privilege, because we don't really support artists in this country. And so often the only people who can make it as artists are white people with privilege. And that's the place we speak from. So one of the really important experiences I had was being at University of Arizona MFA. At the time I met another writer who became one of my readers of an essay that's very similar to chapter 4 pretty early on. And she was able to really say, like, how did you know there were those programs? And, how are the ways that you had access to the money to keep you afloat? Like talk about your financial relationship with your father. I really got asked hard questions by my readers, because there are things that I might have taken for granted as part of my story that any reader, even slightly different from myself, really would have sniffed out and been like, total lack of awareness, and this reads as tinny. And I think a book that wants to express a particular type of truth, especially about something like the healthcare system, has to be aware of its positioning. We're trying to tell the whole story, and the whole story for someone like me, even in the ways that I am a victim of the system at points in this book, I'm still not a victim of the system in the same way that other people are a victim of the system. There are just a lot of layers to the way that can play out. And I ended up getting this heart surgery donated by the cardiologist, the surgeon who performed the first procedure. He got St. Jude Medical to donate a device. He got the anesthesiologist to donate a device. And then Boulder Community Hospital essentially wrote off $87,000. And you can really ask that question of, like, would that have been the outcome if I were a Black woman? Would that have been the outcome if I did not have a high level of education and didn't feel comfortable trying to sort of find the holes in the system and like being sort of a sympathizable character, right? This doctor really went to bat for me and my sister, and maybe he would have done that, especially for any young person. I tend to think he in particular would have, but there are other points in this story where the only reason I make it through the healthcare system is because individuals are willing to bend over backwards. And when that's the case, the system is not functioning. Human kindness is sort of like peeking through, but human kindness also can get paired with bias. And it's just really important to make sure that, to whatever extent I have something to say about the system, which I do, I still got really beat up through these experiences, but it is fundamentally still positioned from the starting point of, like, white girl who was living in Jackson Hole, right? So that's one piece of it. And then, I studied global health and development a little bit in college, and I'm sure that's part of why that seed was lodged in my brain when I was thinking about, like, the way people experience different health outcomes based on where they live. And it was pretty humbling to be reporting from any part of the African continent, because the colonial history there is just so intense. And I did not understand when I first went. I've done much more anti-racism work since then, but I did not understand when I first went in 2014, the way that just bringing your body into a space can be an act of violence, can be perceived that way by a community, can be deeply uncomfortable and laden with a lot of unspoken, maybe hard to identify for me, things. And so there were villages I was in where people were really excited to see me, and there were villages I was in where my presence felt primarily extractive. It was like, here comes someone else wanting something from us, and, like, are you gonna help? Like, is there a way this comes back to us? Are you going to pay us? Like a lot of uncomfortable stuff there. And so as I processed those experiences, there were a lot of places it was hard to write. And it's like, why is this so hard to write? And it's like, because you have to see yourself clearly on the page. You have to see the sort of entitlement with which you're showing up and the way that you're asking people for their stories, but then maybe not totally believing them because you have this whole other paradigm that you're from. Meaning like the way Western society privileges studies and highly educated folks over like normal people in villages sharing their experience of what it's been like with a mining company around. And really beginning to crunch for me then, what is it that those folks are telling me that they need? And how does an elaborate life-saving technology like mine compared to just like the basic need for food, for antibiotics, for mosquito nets, for, there are a number of countries on the African continent that don't have any cardiologists at all. And the theoretical need for something like an ICD is much higher there because you still have a lot of like fevers and parasitic infections that can cause inflammation of the heart. So yeah, there was just this whole unhinging of like, oh my God, okay, like where am I positioned within the US, but then also where am I positioned within this larger story? And that's part of what makes it such an impossible question to answer. But I also feel like it's why it's so important to try to grapple with the pieces and sort of like make your brain hurt enough to have all these things in the same conversation.
Thank you. So ultimately, what do you hope readers take away from Lightning Flowers?
Oh, that's a big question for me. The book is dedicated to myself, which may sound a little bit weird, except that, the line is to the girl in the parking lot, here is the book you needed. And I think for a long time, it was hard for me to understand who the audience was because I hadn't met anyone other than myself and my sister who'd had some of these experiences. And now that the book is out, there are a lot of people who are the girl in the parking lot. And it has been both validating and horrifying to learn that, to be connected with other people who have technologies stranded inside them or who have the same problem I have, but have ended up on the transplant list, or who don't have a heart condition, but went through cancer at a young age and experienced the same shifts in their partnerships, maybe had a romantic breakup or the relationship is still different. So I hope that there's a sort of solace that we get from good literature where other people are able to say something in that way that we've never been able to put our finger on, that tells us about our life and our experience. And that whether it makes a kind of emotional integration or release possible, or whether it's just solace to know that this is part of what it means to be human. It's been very hard to talk about this part, but I do fundamentally see this as a book about what it means to be subject to death and go on living. That all of us are living in relationship to death every single day, and we live in a culture that doesn't really have cyclic rituals or any kind of like meaningful education about what death really means. Much more of the time we view aging as a deterioration and failure. We view death as a failure. We're all about big technological interventions. Even with climate change, people think technology is going to magically save the day. There's a sort of like real resistance to thinking about endings and understanding them as life-giving, and then also understanding how you can be alive and still have experienced deaths and actually be full of death, or be living and not really be alive. I mean, I know so many of us, especially coming out of COVID, had that sort of like half deadness. And so this story is really about this moment that I was 24 and I woke up in a parking lot and I maybe had been dead for a few minutes and my heart happened to restart. And so I had this rebirth. And then I thought a technology was going to prevent death. You know, if I get the technology, then I can't die. And what the book slowly does over the course of all those chapters is like, actually, you can still die of this. And like, actually, you can have the life-saving technology, but have it break inside you in a way that causes death. Oh, also, navigating the healthcare system might make you so insane that you can't connect with the meaning of life. You don't want to be alive, even as you're fighting for a potentially life-saving surgery. Just that twistedness where, you know, I don't know that there's any human that is completely settled minute to minute in their relationship to death, but I know that I'm in a very different place than I used to be. There's been some kind of initiation that has occurred through the living of these experiences and then the writing of them. And I do think that underneath our daily lives, we are hungry for reconnecting some of those pieces that in other cultures are more naturally connected. And so I do hope that people finish this book thinking about like, what does it mean for me to feel alive? And what are the places that medical interventions truly are life-saving and life-giving? And in this book, one of the examples for me is that I almost died of sepsis, and IV antibiotics definitely saved my life. But on the other hand, what are the ways that I'm subtly undermining my living? Or what are the ways our systems actually, we say that they're healthcare, but they're not caring at all, and they're decreasing people's ability to live their lives. So there's a real cluster in there, a cluster of ideas, but I hope that there's a sort of like sense of needing to chew a little bit more on those questions and carrying that question around in ways that maybe can seed our culture with just a little bit more death consciousness.
Thank you so much. We only have you for a little longer, so I do want to let participants know if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. We can unmute you. You can write your question in the chat or Q&A. We can read them for you. So any questions or comments, feel free to ask now. But while we wait for any of those to come in, what is next for Katherine Standefer and your future endeavors and writing career?
Yeah, I would love a crystal ball on that one. You know, the book just had its first birthday last week. She came out right between the election and the insurrection and in the middle of the COVID surge. And so it's been interesting to try to chart like what she's going to do. But I have a paperback coming out in May. So there will definitely be a little bit more on this book, more hopefully book tours with festivals that are actually open and that kind of stuff, in-person workshops, I hope. Otherwise, for me, yeah, it's been really a process. This book was my whole life, frankly. For 8 years, I'm single and I'm intentionally childless. I now do have chickens. So I have like someone else that I invest some energy in beyond my, far-flung friends. But it was really jarring to try to transition off this book that had even sort of been my will to live for a while, where I just pushed all my energy into it. And so I'm really reconnecting right now with, I think, the other side of that question, which is if Lightning Flowers is about what does it mean to live knowing that death is possible all the time. On the other hand, what does it actually mean to fully come back to life, to not live in that suspended state of, well, I probably will be dead within the year. So, really, it can make things really meaningful. It also can make things really meaningless. And my body is feeling much better after doing a lot of that trauma work. Thank goodness, I'm able to run again, and I really enjoy being in nature and in the world. But I'm thinking a lot about Eros and these sort of things that make us come alive. I'm thinking a lot about sexuality, which is another topic I write about a lot. And I worked at a sexual health clinic in my 20s that I sort of have a project percolating around, especially given the recent Texas abortion law. So yeah, without saying too much, that's sort of where I'm chewing right now.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to reading anything else that you produce. You're such an amazing writer and researcher and person. So I just want to thank you a million times for doing this program with us. You speak so thoroughly, so I don't look like anyone has any questions. You may have answered them throughout, so thank you so much. And thank you to the Friends of the Santa Fe Public Library for sponsoring this event so we could have Katherine Standefer with us this evening. Thanks everyone who was here this evening. You can find more information on Katherine Standefer as well as where to find her books at katherinestandefer.com. You can also find lightning flowers on the shelves of the Santa Fe Public Library, as well as your local bookstores. I encourage everyone to pick up a copy if you haven't yet.
And if you need Christmas presents, I sign books often at Collected Works and Garcia.
Yes, thank you so much. We just have a couple of thank yous. So I was reading in the chat. So your program was enjoyed, Katherine.
Thank you so much to everyone for being here, and thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, and all my best to you and everything you're working on. Take care of yourself.